Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Politico Speakeasy. We are going to continue on with our programming this afternoon. So in order to introduce our next very special guest, I'm going to welcome back to our stage my colleague Jan Chinsky. He is our senior policy editor. So please give them a round of applause as we get our next conversation underway. Thank you.
Hi again, and I would like to welcome my next guest, who is General Aurelio Colagrande, the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Transformation at NATO. Thanks again for coming. Obviously, you don't have a political role, so we have to keep the conversation on a more sort of a military side of things. Are you able to talk about the back and forth of the American troop deployment in Poland, Hegseth's decision last week to stop the deployment of the armored brigade, and Trump's decision last night to send 5,000 troops to Poland? What does that mean for defense readiness and NATO capabilities if you've got this sort of back and forth of American troops? Does that create confusion? How does that work at a military level?
First of all, good afternoon. Thank you for having me, because this will give me the opportunity to talk about what we are doing in ACT, my command in NATO. To answer the question, I think that from a military standpoint, from a NATO standpoint, what we need to do is make sure that Europe, as a nation, can keep with the innovative responsibility that all nations have agreed in different occasions to assume for the defense of Europe. So answering the question means that Europe is taking bigger responsibility in making sure that they have better, bigger and faster military capabilities to cope with the threats that we can see in the future.
Some intelligence assessments talk about a potential Russian attack within as little as 5 years, 2029, 2030, that sort of thing. What's your assessment of where the alliance stands in readiness? Many people point to a 5 or 6 year gap of rearmament and capabilities to be able to handle that. So this is actually a pretty dangerous time right now in NATO's capabilities. Do you agree with that, or?
First of all, let me say that NATO so far has been able to cope with all the provocation and threats that are coming from the east side of the alliance. You remember the drone incursion in September and the continuous incursion that we're still seeing lately. We've been able to cope with the incursion of a missile in Turkey coming from Iran. So the message is NATO today is able to fight and to respond to any threat we can see. The problem is also that we cannot, of course, keep shooting 1,000 Euro drones with 1 million missiles. So we need to improve our capabilities to cope with the new threats that we are seeing coming. But I believe we are doing anything we can to do that. And for this specific item, I can give you a practical example of what we are doing in ACT. Last September, when we saw this drone incursion, we reacted to that, bringing together a number of industry under a program called LCIX, Layer Counter UAS Initiatives. So we brought together a number of industry with their already systems that they already have, and we tested them in the most realistic scenario, confronted them with a number of red systems so that they could prove to themselves, but also to the military and the nations, what they were capable of doing under a single command and control chain. So in terms of interoperability, they could see exactly how their systems were performing and what are the capabilities, what are the gaps that they need to fill in order to be able to respond to the threats that are coming from the other side. And this is helpful because we are shortening in this way also the timeline that today is required from when we see a new requirement coming to the day when we will be able to provide the warfighters with the capability to fight against that new requirement.
So you talk about the technology chain and sort of the speed of innovation, but there was the drone incidents over Poland last year, where exactly what you mentioned, that very, very expensive missiles were used to shoot down Shahed and even cheaper Buran Russian drones. However, we had more or less the same thing happen over Estonia just a little while ago, where that Romanian jet again used a very expensive missile to shoot down I guess it was a Ukrainian drone, the misdirected Ukrainian drone over Estonia. That seems to indicate that hasn't actually happened, that you're still using the same methods. So what needs to actually happen for NATO countries to shift dramatically to start using this cheaper and faster tech?
Yeah, of course you cannot have a new capability overnight. Okay, so it takes a little bit of a time to develop new capabilities. And again, we use LCIX, this experimentation and exercise, to improve also the timeline that we require for coping with the new threat and give the warfighter the ability to cope with the threat. So what we are doing in LCIX program is to have several iterations. So we already had one exercise in Romania in April. We will have a new one in June in the Baltic countries, so that when the industry that already took part in the first exercise, when they go to the next one, we provide them the new requirements that are coming directly from the battlefield, and they also can see directly what are the improvements in their products. And so nations can exactly understand what is already available in the market and shorten the time that they can procure that type of capabilities.
When you look at what you're trying to do in civilian economies that are not at all on a war footing, and so you obviously are trying to do the tech, the speeding up, the integration with the military and the corporate and the tech side. But when you look at what the Ukrainians and the Russians are doing, they are orders of magnitude faster than NATO countries. So is it entirely hopeless that by the time you go through the very slow development process, the procurement process, everybody's sort of thinking about it, they're putting out tenders. After a few years, they have this new, cheaper technology. The Ukrainians and Russians are doing this in months. So there's just no sense that NATO could ever catch up to countries on a real war footing fighting an existential war. So how do you square that?
Well, you know, we understand exactly what the Ukrainians are doing. Frankly, it's difficult being on a peacetime environment. Thank God we are in a peacetime environment to be able to catch up with that speed. But for sure, we can improve dramatically the speed that we were used to when, in procuring new systems. And again, what we are doing is try to shorten it as much as possible. And for the specific reason, we created last year in Bydgoszcz, Poland, a center called JTEC, Joint Analysis Training and Education Center, where we have Ukrainian warfighters and NATO warfighters working together on a daily basis in the same building, so that we can have a direct feed from the battlefield to our headquarters and understand exactly what we need to do in order to improve our capabilities. Of course, it takes a little bit of time, but under the peacetime rule, that's the best we can do.
So what the Ukrainians seem to have done is that they've created for the first time, a fully integrated electronic battlefield awareness system where they've got links to drones, to satellites, to on-the-ground soldiers, feeding it all back to commanders who have a live picture of the war. I think the Americans looked at this, they don't have it yet. I assume that other European NATO countries are even further behind. So are you looking at that particular capability, and how far behind the curve is NATO in being able to replicate that?
Well, we are looking at every single lesson that we can learn from the Ukrainian battlefield. Keeping in mind that maybe the next war will not be the same as it is in Ukraine, but we are trying to make the best use of what capabilities the Ukrainians are introducing into the battlefield. And of course, the data fusion, data dissemination, and the data analysis are all things that make the difference on the battlefield. And we are working hard on that to make sure that we can provide that type of response to our warfighters in a timely manner.
So one of our reporters was in Gotland in Sweden for a military training exercise that just ended today. And we'll have the story early next week, so you should look at Politico to read that. They had some Ukrainians invited who used their drones to knock out a Swedish armored unit several times, and the Swedes had to stop the exercise but this has happened before. I think there was an exercise in Estonia or in the Baltics where the Ukrainians did the same thing again. So are you looking at that experience, and how does that feed into your, the view of a traditional NATO armor, air power based way of fighting a war with what the Ukrainians are discovering?
Yeah, we, based on those experiences, at ACT have launched several programs. One of them is called Future Lethality Enhancement Program, where we are testing for a number of capabilities we already have. What are the possibilities we have to improve their lethality and their combat capabilities, and to do that in order of weeks, months, and not years like it used to be before. To give you an example, we did a study on how to improve armored brigade capabilities, and we, through modeling simulation and war games, were able to assess if we introduce into our armored brigades autonomous systems and AI capabilities, we will increase the capabilities of those armored brigades, reducing the number of personnel in a dramatic way. So these are the lessons that we are already learning, and we will be introducing those capabilities in every nation, but it's up to the nation after we demonstrated that there are different ways to reach improved capabilities, to procure them and to make sure that they have those capabilities. To give you another example, we are working on a program called Audacious Training, where we are introducing artificial intelligence into our major NATO exercises. Doing that, we want to improve in three different areas. Today, to design a major exercise, we take months, we take a lot of personnel, and we, introducing artificial intelligence, have demonstrated that we can dramatically reduce the number of personnel and the time that we need to design a major exercise. But most importantly, we have demonstrated that if we introduce AI into our exercises, we can give a free play to the, usually there are two parties fighting each other according to a design script for the exercise. Introducing AI into that, we can really arrive to free play. So when the red team responds to the blue team tactics, they are free to do that and not following, a script that was already designed weeks or months.
So more flexible and looser.
Absolutely, and that improves the realism of the exercise in a dramatic way.
So now Ukraine is using Palantir, I think, tech as they bring AI into their warfighting technology. Anthropic ran into trouble in the United States. The Trump administration had a big fight with them. What are the issues for ethical AI use? You're talking about using it for exercises. What about using AI for warfighting capabilities for killing people? How do you? Are there ethical breaks on that? Is that being studied, or are you just powering ahead with that?
Okay, thank you for this question, because I think it's very, very important. First of all, we are introducing in the near future a new program called Next Generation Targeting, where with the use of AI, we want to be able to analyze and process the largest number possible of lessons coming from the battlefield, but also the data that are needed to make a precise targeting campaign. But we will do that always maintaining the man in the loop. So the man, we will have the latest.
The final authority of the
Absolutely,
human.
absolutely. Yeah.
Does that? But again, does that not? The Ukrainians are seeing this. Is if you add that human into the decision chain, you make it easier for the enemy to block the signal, to interfere with the mission. So there's going to be a temptation to speed it up, make it more resilient. So then it means you give more autonomy to the AI system, right?
Well, I cannot tell right now, where the technology will bring us, in the next few months or years. But at the moment, that's our, the way we stand. We believe that we need still the man in the loop.
Right. Now, a large part of what's happening in AI and tech is driven by companies that are not traditionally defense companies. How do you integrate startups, SMEs, tech companies into a more traditional defense environment that's been dominated by legacy companies that are good at making tanks and artillery shells?
Well, we are trying to integrate them, bringing the industry closer to the warfighters. Okay, and what I mentioned before, JTech, is designed to do exactly that. So what is going on on the battlefield can be directly fed to our headquarters, and from headquarters directly to industry. One of the new initiatives that we will be putting in place, it's called a type of a marketplace approach, where we bring together industry, we see what their capabilities they have, they can provide already available, and then nations can decide what to procure. So we are not a procurement agency at AZT, but what we are doing, trying to close the gap between industry and warfighters.
When you talk about a marketplace, I'm assuming you're not talking about the same kind of marketplace the Ukrainians have created, where units get credits for destroyed Russian equipment and killed Russian soldiers at various levels, and then they can cash in those credits so that equipment and resources are dedicated or streamed to the more successful units. How does your marketplace work in the same way, or what do you?
Well, we are watching very closely what the Ukrainians are doing in terms of new procurement. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can do or we will do the same, because the situations are different. But for sure, we are learning all the lessons we can learn for what they're doing from the battlefield, but also in the procurement process.
So I wanted to also maybe switch away from the high tech thing for a second. One of the decisions by Donald Trump a couple of weeks ago of pulling the forces out of Germany affects a long-range fires unit that was going to be in Germany later this year, equipped with Tomahawk missiles, which is a gap. European countries don't have that capability right now. There's some talk of piggybacking on Ukrainian tech, that the Ukrainians are actually, with Flamingo and other missiles, developing a 1,500 to 2,000 kilometer range conventional missile tech that the Europeans don't have. Is that something that NATO is looking at, of teaming up with Ukraine on that as a short-term solution?
Yeah, absolutely. The offensive and defensive posture of our capabilities is something that we are considering. Of course, NATO will remain for sure a defensive alliance, but probably we need in the future more offensive capabilities.
And these missiles would fit that role?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, could be good.
And again, how interested are you in what the Ukrainians, is it useful for you to exactly use the Ukrainian tech, or is there going to be more effort for the Europeans to upgrade their existing missiles or to develop their own long-range fires independently of Ukraine?
At the moment, I cannot say if we will be able to use what the Ukrainians are developing and producing. But for sure, we are bringing together, and in Europe, we can see already that Ukrainian industries are cooperating with the European industry, both for having a large number of the things that they need, but also for the European industry to learn directly from and cooperate directly with the Ukrainian industry. So that's a possibility in the future.
At the beginning, you talked a little bit about the effort to sort of boost production, especially in Europe. How do you see that balance between the pressure and need for Europe to stand more on its own, to develop more of its own tech, which means also developing its own domestic arms industry, and that pressure, you get the sort of weird pressure from America, increase your defense spending, become more independent, but keep on buying lots of American weapons. And they're not very happy with any efforts to sort of push a buy European policy. So how does NATO navigate that very complicated depiction?
Well, in NATO we don't make any type of procurement activity, but we of course can tell the nation what are the capabilities they need to develop. Then it's up to them deciding what are the means that they need to cope with the capabilities that we require from them. And also what we can do is trying to have not to have duplications between nations, so each nation can concentrate on the capability that we can require them, and we can provide the
sensible integration. So
absolutely, yeah. Right. A better integration, and the most important thing is to make sure that the systems that they procure are interoperable. So the magic word in this case is interoperability. Then it's up to the nation to see what they want to do.
So all the systems work together sensibly. Fantastic. Thank you very, very much for agreeing to this chat. And I am going to be back again. I am going to be talking with Hanno Pevkur, Estonia's Minister of Defense, after a short break. So don't go away. And thanks again for agreeing to the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.